Hey class, it's Bill here with a video demo for week 6 using multi-dimensional arrays. This is a fun thing and one that you may not have touched on in other classes. The concept isn't really as hard as it may seem, and I think if we do an example together, you'll see that it's a pretty reasonable thing and not too scary really at all. So the demo that we're going to do is a hotel's wedding suite. We want to know for this particular room in a given day of the year, we want to know whether the room is open or whether it is booked. And so we'd like some sort of way to maintain all of this data internally. Now, in the real world, would you store this stuff in an array? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. But certainly there are times when scientific data and other things that you are munging are going to be stored in an array. So we're using this problem as a gateway to sort of understanding the concept, and you will find uses for arrays and two-dimensional arrays at some point along the line perhaps. So that's what we want to do. We're going to use a two-dimensional array to solve the problem, and let's just talk a little bit about how that's going to work. Well, in considering the data structures, we might first consider, well, we could just store this as a big, long, single-dimension array. We could have one element for each day of the year, and that means we would need 366 slots, right? An array with 366 elements, and that'd be fine, except that's always going to require some translation between the month and the day, and then how that works to index into the array. So maybe that's not really the best data structure conceptually, but we could consider a two-dimensional array for this. And you can think of this as, sort of a table where you would have one dimension, you might think of them as rows, representing the month, and the second dimension, in this case columns, representing the day. And let's pretend right now for the moment that all months have 31 days, and that's, that we'll handle that in a minute. But one thing to note here is it is artificial but traditional to think of in a two-dimensional array to think of the first dimension as a row and the second dimension as a column. As you'll see, as you get more dimensions, you stop having a spatial understanding of the data, but it doesn't keep you from still using these things. So it is artificial, but we'll sort of think of it this way. The most important thing is you understand which dimension you're using for what thing. And once you understand that, you could actually attack the problem pretty good. Now, we're going to use an enum. Remember that arrays are big chunks of memory set aside, contiguous memory, and they always store like objects. They store one type of object, not different types, unless they are pointers, references to objects, which can store multiple kinds of data. But even so, it's the same thing. They're always the same type of object. So the things that we're going to store is just an enum, right? An enumerated value that's going to say, is it booked? Is it going to be open and available? Or it's going to be NA. Now, NA, not applicable, is going to be useful because, again, we're assuming all months have 31 days, and that's not really true. So we're going to have have a way to mark those things so that we know which ones we shouldn't be able to use. So let's look at a conceptual sort of object diagram to see what this thing's going to look like. Well, we're going to have this thing called a suite status, and that's going to be a reference to an array in memory. And that array is going to have 12 rows, right? And that's 0 through 11. That represents the months. So here's all the months represented on the left, and here's all the days of the month represented on the top. And each one of those little blocks is going to store an enumerated value. Remember, under the covers, an enumerated value is just an integer, right? So basically, this is an array, a two-dimensional array of integers. Now, one of the things that we don't like right off the bat is the fact that these are numbered 0 through 11 because, after all, we're in a zero-based world for most languages these days. So one of the things that's inconvenient is the fact that when we talk about the 12th month of the year, we're talking about the 11th row of the array. That's not necessarily fun, so we have two choices. We can either make the array one bigger and waste the 0th element, but have it be conceptually matching our reality, which is a possible thing. It's not that much space, it's integers. Or we just have to make sure that we're careful in our approaches, in our functions, and in our coding to make sure we subtract the 1. you know. So that's something we can certainly deal with as we write functions. We can certainly be smart about that and just make the functions take care of the work for us, and then try to focus our work on a few functions that do that stuff and then rely on those. So that's all great. So those are some options here, but this is the nature of the problem, and this is what we're going to do to attack the problem. So let's get started with the easy part. Let's create the enumerated value because that's super easy, and then let's maybe cut the video there and then move on to how we're going to code the thing in the next video now that we understand the general problem. So let's look at our project, right? We have a project, but it doesn't have a whole lot in it right now. It's called Suite Booking. It has nothing in it. So I'm going to make a new thing, and I'm going to make it a new class, and in this case, not a class, but an enum, and I'm going to call this, oh, something like status, all right? So this is our status class. It's really an enum. And then in that guy, I'll put this in the corner here, I'm going to write a little description, and I will switch out the provided days of the week and put in the new stuff. So you see here, I've put in the Java doc stuff at the top, and then I've just made three simple enumerated values. It's either going to be booked, it's going to be open, or it's going to be not applicable, and we're going to use that to represent things that aren't even valid days, because again, 31 days, it doesn't make sense in certain months, so we're going to mark those with not applicable, and then we know that that's sort of off limits and shouldn't be used. That should compile. Of course, we haven't really done anything, so that's great, but we have our status. The next thing we need to do is make our main project, so I'm going to do that. I'm just going to call it main. I'm not going to make an object-oriented program to speak of here. That's certainly interesting to do, but we're going to try to focus here on getting some of this code and how the basic array stuff works. So I'm not going to bother with that concept at the moment. So let me paste in and create just a very basic main for you. I'll put this in the corner. Okay, so now we have main that is present, and we have a main function that is present, public static void, of course. Now, the one thing that let's do before we sort of cut the video and then move on to the interesting stuff, let's actually create the array, because that's sort of the meat and potatoes here. So let's create, let's say, create the array to hold the statuses. All right, so let's just say status. Okay, so how does this work? Well, remember, as always, when we create variable names, we give it a type. So I'm going to do something about status, right? Status is the enumerated type, which is integers at its base. So we know we need to create that, and we know we need to create a reference to an array, right? And normally, when we did an array last time, we did this. Well, but this time it's 2 dimensions, so we do this. So this says I am going to create a reference to a 2-dimensional array of statuses, and I'm going to call it suite status. And then, remember, that's a reference, but it's not pointing to an actual array because the array hasn't been created yet. So I say, hey, I want to make something new. I want to conjure up some new memory, some new objects. And I'm going to say I need to make an array of status types. And then now we actually make the thing happen. Now, in this case, we don't have to read anything from a file. We know exactly how many things we want. We want the first dimension to represent months and the second dimension to represent days. So that is how we create our 2-dimensional array. Again, you could put month first and day second. I think conceptually most problems lend themselves to understanding which thing makes sense. You put the major thing first and the minor thing second, and that kind of works itself out. But from our diagram, if it helps, go back to that and conceive of it as here's all the months, here's all the days. In 2 dimensions, you can certainly think of it as just a table, right? So that's how we create the array. Now, this is the basis for what we're going to do, and then we're going to work with this because we want to know, how do I work with these things? How do I drill into the array, set things and things like that? So we will continue that in the next video, but so far we've created an array. It works. We could certainly set a breakpoint here. We could do something silly, and let's see, what else could we do here? Well, just for fun, let's say int I equals 1, right? Let's put something stupid in here, make sure it compiles, and then we can go and prove to ourselves that when we run this guy, it actually does something valid. Right here we have our sweet status array. We can double click on that. We see that it has 12. Remember, this is the first dimension now, where it doesn't have a great way to show us 2 dimensions. And if you think of it, a 2-dimensional array is an array of arrays, right? And if we look at the first one, right, the first month, we see that it has 31 days, and right now all of the values are set to null. That's an interesting point that we might take up later, but by default all of these things are null pointers, right? They just don't exist. They don't point to anything yet, right? The data is empty in the middle of the table, so we need to fix that. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what's going on in the program and where we get started with things. Now, let's continue in the next video to actually do some coding with this so we understand a little more deeply how to deal with these things. Thanks for watching this video.